Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a historical mystery that quite literally breaks all the rules we thought we knew about human history. When we picture ancient, complex civilizations, we usually imagine towering pyramids, ruthless emperors, and just a massive underclass of laborers toiling away, right? But what if I told you there was an incredibly advanced ancient society that tossed that entire playbook completely out the window? We are looking at a sprawling, deeply complex civilization that seems to have had no ruling class, no monuments to kings, and practically no extreme inequality. It's a genuine historical enigma, and honestly, the deeper archaeologists dig, the more fascinating this whole thing becomes.
Okay, let's kick things off with a number that shows just how baffled modern experts still are by the society. $1 million. That is the massive, unclaimed reward currently being offered by the Indian government to anyone who can successfully decipher the ancient Indus Valley Script. We're talking about a 5,700-year-old writing system that remains totally locked to us today. No one can read it. Because of that, we have to rely entirely on the physical evidence they left behind in the dirt. And what that evidence tells us is nothing short of revolutionary.
Which leads us directly to the core question of this explainer. How exactly did an ancient society thrive without kings? Across the ancient world, it was just assumed that collective action, urbanization, and a specialized economy could only happen with a really rigid top-down hierarchy. You needed a king to crack the whip, basically. But the Indus Valley, which spread across vast chunks of modern-day Pakistan and India, completely challenges that fundamental assumption.
Just to ground us in time for a second, the Indus Valley Civilization, which you'll also hear called the Harappan civilization, emerged around 3300 BCE as these early farming communities. By 2600 BCE, they hit their urban peak. And they did this right alongside the legendary empires of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. They eventually went through a mysterious decline around 1300 BCE, but the absolutely crucial point here is that for over a millennia, they were contemporaries of the pharaohs and the Mesopotamian kings. Yet, they operated in a completely alien way. Sir John Marshall, who was a pioneering archaeologist overseeing a lot of the early excavations, noted this really stark, fascinating contrast. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, all the wealth and labor were poured into magnificent temples, palaces, and monumental tombs for the absolute elite, while the common folks lived in pretty insignificant mud dwellings. But in the Indus Valley, it is the exact opposite. The finest structures were actually built for the convenience of everyday citizens.
I mean, just look at this incredible structure. This is the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. It is a massive, meticulously paved water tank, and it was remarkably waterproofed using bitumen, which is a naturally occurring asphalt. But the most important thing to notice is what it isn't. It is not a tomb for a god king. It's not some gated palace closed off to the public. Their greatest architectural marvels were literally built for communal use. This was a society prioritizing shared spaces and public infrastructure over glorifying one single guy at the top.
Let's break down exactly what that public infrastructure looked like, because their urban planning was thousands of years ahead of its time. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro featured these incredibly precise grid-patterned street layouts intersecting at perfect right angles. They had elaborate underground drainage systems made of baked clay pipes, whisking wastewater away from homes. We're talking about multi-story residential homes equipped with private wells and their own private bathrooms. They were deeply, systematically committed to sanitation, public health, and civic order. And here's one of the most astounding discoveries about their architecture. Across their entire massive territory, they used uniform, standardized, kiln-fired mud bricks. They even used precise mathematical ratios for these bricks. You just don't get that level of strict, widespread standardization without incredible, large-scale coordination. But again, if there's no tyrannical ruler forcing everyone to do this, how did they organize this massive labor force? Well, that brings us to the really fascinating mechanics of their economic engine. It all comes down to how they fed these sprawling cities. A recent study analyzed over 1,100 ancient plant remains excavated from Harappa. Now, for a long time, experts just sort of assumed families processed their own crops individually at home. But the new data revealed a massive paradigm shift. They found a huge concentration of grain relative to chaff inside the city. What does that mean? It tells us the food was grown out in rural areas, processed by a massive collective labor force outside the city walls, and then transported in a pre-processed state right into the urban centers.
But researchers hit a pretty big snag with this theory, which led to an amazing pivot. If the grain was pre-processed before it ever entered the city, why were archaeologists finding tiny weed seeds scattered all throughout Harappan homes? Originally, everyone just assumed this was evidence of dirty, unprocessed grain being cleaned by individual families inside. But modern botanical analysis revealed something totally different. Plot twist: those specific weeds weren't mixed in with human crops at all. They were the types of plants eaten by cattle. And that brings us to this amazing quote from the researchers. The weed seeds were in the homes because of cow dung. Yep, the ancient Harappans were incredibly resourceful. They were burning cattle dung as a highly reliable, steady heat source for daily cooking and even major industrial activities like producing glazed ceramics known as faience. So they essentially powered a thriving, complex ancient economy with cow patties. It was a massive, decentralized industrial practice that kept everything running without relying on scarce timber. Which loops us right back to our central mystery. We have this society with centralized agriculture, highly standardized manufacturing, and absolutely massive public works. Archaeologists have calculated that just laying the foundation platforms for some of their public structures would have required 4 million days of labor. Think about that. That is 10,000 builders working collectively for over a year. In literally any other ancient society, the people commanding that kind of labor would demand to be buried in gold. Yet, no grand tombs, no extravagantly wealthy, gated neighborhoods. Seriously, where are the rulers? This brings us to a concept that is shaking up the entire archaeological world: heterarchy. It's a complex political organization that emerges through the interaction of many different unranked social groups, rather than from top-down decisions made by an elite class. Think of it like a giant puzzle where all the pieces work together perfectly, but no single piece is the boss. Basically, it proves that cooperation, consensus, and shared goals can produce massive collective action just as effectively as coercion and domination. And the evidence for this highly egalitarian society is literally everywhere in the dirt. Over 2,500 stamped seals have been found at Mohenjo-daro alone, but they weren't manufactured in some royal, heavily guarded workshop. They were produced by diverse, decentralized groups of artisans. There's zero evidence that any specific group hoarded scarce materials from long-distance trade. No one was gatekeeping the good stuff. Technological knowledge was openly shared. Even those massive public buildings we talked about were highly accessible, likely serving as places where different neighborhoods could get together, negotiate, and reach a consensus. So, pulling the whole shebang together, the legacy of the Indus Valley is just staggering. They were innovating urban planning with grids and standard weights. They completely revolutionized public health with underground drainage and private bathrooms. They engineered a highly efficient economy trading all the way with Mesopotamia. But their absolute greatest innovation, it might just be how they govern themselves. By operating as a heterarchy, they proved that extreme social stratification isn't a strict requirement for a complex technological society. Egalitarianism was actually their superpower for building sustainable cities. Which leaves us with a pretty big so what and an incredibly provocative final thought. The Indus Valley Civilization thrived for centuries. They built marvels of engineering, managed vast trade networks, and coordinated massive labor forces, all seemingly without the extreme inequality, the slavery, and the ruling classes that define the rest of the ancient world. They proved it is humanly possible. So, if they could build a thriving, complex civilization based on cooperation rather than domination over 5,000 years ago, what's stopping us today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history you've been taught.